Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies about the technical delay. That was entirely my fault because I sent the slides so late to Igor. So I am to blame for the technical difficulties. But I will be presenting on pluralistic governance solutions for green shipping. So we've spoken a bit about the regulatory regime. I'm focusing more on private actors and how private actors are supplementing that regulatory regime. I'm also going to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I've just written a book on green shipping. I've got 2 copies available for anyone who's interested. So these are going if you have an interest in green shipping. And the themes I discussed today are dealt with in depth in the book. It's through Hot Publishing. So I'm sure many of you might already have access to it through your university platforms. Okay, so we've done the public law regime in the previous 2 presentations, which were very helpful presentations for me to follow on from, because we spoke about these measures, the CII measure, which is an operational measure, as well as the Energy Efficiency Index, which is a design measure. So that is at the IMO level. But there's also the EU Fit for 55 package, a legislative suite, which has introduced a whole lot of new requirements for shipping as well. And many of the new directives that have come out as part of this Fit for 55 package do impact on shipping and shipping fuels, as well as things such as tax. And then the focus of today's presentation is really going to be on what are private actors doing. And I really want to move away from this mindset that green shipping really involves the regulator and ship owner. And those are the only 2 people who are involved in this whole paradigm of how we achieve decarbonization. Because the reality is there's far many more actors who are going to need to have to come on board to decarbonize shipping. And these actors span a number of sectors. They span banking and finance. We also have green chartering as an area, which we know many lawyers are going to have to get involved in to assist with the contractual implications. There's the insurance industry. There's the P&I clubs. Everyone is going to have to come on board, from bunker suppliers to fuel innovators to member states to third countries. So this really is going to be a collective action solution. It's not going to just be the ship owner's responsibility. There are numbers of people involved in this. So we know about the IMO measures. I just want to show you a bit about how extensive the Fit for 55 package is in terms of how it's going to impact shipping. There's a matrix of new laws that are applicable to shipping. And at least I can speak for shipping lawyers in London. None of them really know what any of this means yet because they're not regulatory lawyers. And they're trying to figure out how you're going to integrate all of these new requirements into contracts. I work quite closely with the firm Stevenson Harwood. I do a bit of legal analyst work for them. In fact, I've kind of joined their staff recently. And the reality is no one in that firm knows what any of this means. So that's why I came on board to help with some of the research to explain how these new directives are going to impact ship owners. So you've not only have you got the emission trading scheme, but there's also the finance implication. So the EU has a taxonomy regulation, which deals with funds that are channeled towards certain green projects. Shipping is included in these schemes. The MRV regulation, which is the fuel reporting regulation, Fuel EU Maritime, the Fuel Quality Directive, and the Renewable Energy Directive, which talks about renewable fuels and the contributions that renewable fuels have to make to the total consumption of energy by member states. That piece of legislation, the RED 2, now actually the RED 3, because it was recently amended, is giving me a massive headache. So if anyone professes to be an expert in the Renewable Energy Directive, please come chat to me because I've got many questions for you about how that directive actually operates. And then, of course, we've got the wider CSDDD directive, which requires all EU companies and companies that operate within the EU, whether they be shipping companies or companies related to shipping services, to have to report on their sustainability performance, both in the context of human rights as well as environmental and decarbonization performance. So there's a lot going on. It's overwhelming. It's actually quite difficult to get your head around this matrix of new laws. And for shipping lawyers who are not traditionally regulatory lawyers, it is quite a difficult task. So we're seeing that private actors are going to have to come on board to implement all of these new initiatives. All of these new initiatives are going to have to require various aspects of industry to innovate, to jump on board, and to deliver solutions. So green finance, we have a number of frameworks which are trying to mobilize capital and then channel them towards green shipping projects. But all of them require private actor implementation. We need banks to come on board to create green products for shipping. We also need documentation, so loan form documentation. We need new investment products to get investors to put their money into green projects. So these would be new bonds and guilds and all kinds of financial products that are going to have to be created specifically for sustainable and green finance. And then we've got green chartering, where we are seeing voluntary initiatives start to emerge. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sea Cargo Charter, but green chartering really is a hotspot for contract law debates at the moment, because it really is illustrating the conundrum we have with English common law, because English law still maintains its dominance in shipping contracts. But there really is a conundrum as to how traditional common law is going to deal with sustainability measures. So that's a major contentious area for debate, the modernization of contract law to meet sustainability ends. And then we very recently are seeing developments in marine insurance. Poseidon principles for marine insurance have just come out. But basically, insurers with hull and machinery portfolios are going to have to start creating new products for green shipping. So there's a lot going on. All actors need to jump on board to really put their heads together to solve this decarbonization issue. So I'm going to start with green finance. I think it's probably logical to go through the steps of a ship's lifespan. Let's start with green finance. We'll then move on to chartering and then eventually get to green or marine insurance. But what is green finance? Well, it is endorsed by the United Nations as all the initiatives taken by private and public agents. So these include a number of people from banks to governments in developing and promoting and implementing and supporting projects with sustainable impacts. So we know that all energy transitions, not just for the shipping sector, but every economic sector is going to require huge amounts of capital to invest in new technologies and new fuels and new solutions. The idea behind green finance is that it's going to try and mobilize this finance for the creation of frameworks. So by specifying certain activities that governments want to endorse, that banks want to endorse, and then get the investors on board so you can channel green and sustainable finance into various projects. So we've seen a diverse range of new financial products come out on the market. I'll speak a bit more about some of the voluntary frameworks shortly. But we're going to have to see a lot more financial products come out to specifically channel funds to basically give green finance, which is financing on preferential terms to parties who are more green and sustainable in their performance, who commit to developing something that is green as a green activity or sustainable activity. But within finance in particular, we've also seen the emergence of new risks, greenwashing. Okay, so the whole financial sector is increasingly coming under scrutiny, not only by consumers and regulators, but by activists as well. There's a whole new wave of climate litigation, which is targeting the financial sector. They're targeting many sectors. I think their main focus is the carbon majors, the fossil fuel companies. But there's a wave of activism which is looking at financial products and saying, well, are these investments actually green? Are you misleading the public? Are you misleading investors? So there's a huge risk involved as well. And you've got to be very careful that something you're advertising as green or sustainable is actually such. So we've seen a diversification of taxonomy frameworks. And I think around 2016, there was this realization that we needed to unify frameworks because there were a number of voluntary frameworks and they were all saying that different things were green, which of course results in increased greenwashing risks. So if you're going to say something is sustainable green, there needs to be an agreement as to what those definitions are. And that's why the EU brought out its taxonomy regulation, to give us some clarity and uniformity on what we consider green and to what is actually green or sustainable. So what is the importance of these frameworks? Well, they are said to overcome many of the barriers that are associated with energy transitions more generally. So there's a lot of uncertainty regarding regulatory change. We see that in shipping, we don't know what technologies to invest in. We don't know what fuels are going to deliver the IMO's targets that they have set. So the idea behind a green finance framework is it identifies those fuels for us. It identifies certain technologies or certain activities. that investors should channel money into. It's also set to overcome disagreements about optimal solutions by providing us with a set of activities, or at least a set of technical screening criteria for those activities, for which we can deliver solutions that will achieve our sustainability goals. And it's also set to overcome some of the distribution of power between actors, whether those actors be states or non-states. But we also know that banks are also concerned with risk. Environmental risks are growing. This whole new greenwashing litigation, and green finance frameworks aim to overcome some of those greenwashing risks by providing evidence-based solutions as to what sort of activities can deliver sustainability. So we've seen regulatory and voluntary frameworks emerge. Prior to the EU's green taxonomy regulation, it had some programs under the EIB's traditional lending program. So there were a number of basically schemes available for shipping to apply for finance. But the problem with these schemes is they were very complex, and they were situated within a matrix of EU policy, and the administrative burden was incredibly high. So not many ship owners were accessing these schemes just because the requirements were so demanding. They were so restrictive in their application, and it basically required a company to be very established and have a huge amount of capital to start off with to meet many of the requirements of these programs. So they weren't as successful, I would say, as they probably intended to be, but they were very much focused on the internal market of the union. They were more applicable to inland waterways, and probably a lot of them were not being used for ocean-going shipping. So we had the EU Green Finance Taxonomy come about. So this sets out a set of criteria for activities and provides 4 overarching criteria for environmentally sustainable economic activities, for which then the financial sector is hopefully going to come on board and deliver products that are aligned with these objectives. So I'm not going to go through these objectives in a lot of detail, but really it is the sustainability objectives, the climate objectives of the union, and activities under the framework need to be aligned with those objectives. Under the taxonomy regulation, we've got delegated acts. So the first delegated act deals with climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So the first delegated act is known as the Climate Delegated Act, and it provides technical screening criteria in the context of adaptation and mitigation for a number of sectors. The second delegated act is known as the Environmental Delegated Act, and that act deals more with the other aspects of sustainability, land use, pollution, the other objectives of the EU in meeting its sustainability criteria. So shipping has been included in technical screening criteria for the Climate Delegated Act. And these are the categories of shipping that we now have technical screening criteria for. So there's inland passenger water transport, but more specifically to international shipping. There is also sea and coastal freight, vessels for port operations, sea and coastal passenger transport, also retrofitting of sea and coastal freight, and passenger water transport. So shipping activities and commercial global shipping can definitely fall within the categories that are provided. We have also seen voluntary frameworks. So that's what the EU has been doing to mobilize funds, but a number of voluntary associations have come on board. So here we've got the private actor initiatives coming in terms of voluntary frameworks. The IDFC Common Principles for Climate Adaptation are not so relevant to shipping, but they are worth mentioning. They are much more focused on other forms of transport. And then we have the International Capital Market Association, which has developed sustainability-linked bonds as well as green bonds. So the ICMA is tasked with mobilizing the capital through offering these bond products. And then the Loan Market Association came along and said, well, to match these bonds, we are going to implement loan principles. So the LMA has now developed a set of sustainability-linked loans. So they provided draft documentation as well as green loans. So there's also green loan documentation. What is the difference between a green loan and a sustainability-linked loan? Well, a green loan is a use of proceeds loan. So the money is very specifically for a certain type of project. The proceeds have to be used in a specific way. A sustainability-linked loan is really a loan for the borrower to improve their environmental performance over time. So they've got to be showing constant evidence of improved sustainability over time, as opposed to using the proceeds for something quite specific that a green loan would be more appropriate for. And then you've also got the Climate Bonds Initiative, which uses a green light, yellow light, red light system for good investments, bad investments. It also now includes shipping. And then, of course, the Poseidon Principles, which is one of the earliest initiatives, but that is not a taxonomy initiative, although it is a green finance initiative. It rather uses a carbon efficiency matrix. So we see both the regulator and the private initiatives coming on board here to try and develop frameworks. But with green finance frameworks, and if you're going to use them properly, and if you're going to try and mitigate that greenwashing risk that we see emerging in climate litigation, you're going to have to properly contractually integrate these requirements, because your risk protection is going to come through the contracts that you draft. So we need contractual guidance. And that's what I was talking about when I said the Loan Market Association has developed draft documentation for green loans as well as sustainability-linked loans. The Chancery Lane Project, which is a voluntary association of practitioners based in London, they're doing fantastic work. They've developed almost 150 climate clauses for various sectors. They are growing hugely within London. The problem they're having with shipping is shipping actors are just not using their clauses yet. And I think that's just because shipping lawyers are not really thinking too much about decarbonization in practice yet, because the clients aren't coming to them yet with decarbonization work. I think the work will come a bit later down the line when we start to see disputes about whose responsibility is it for surrendering emission allowances, or whose responsibility is it for reporting on fuel requirements. Then the disputes will arise. But until the disputes arise, clients are kind of putting their head in the sand a bit with the sustainability agenda. The thing with these kinds of contracts that are implementing sustainability frameworks in terms of finance is they are developing unique mechanisms. So we're seeing unique features. We're seeing recitals or purpose of loans provisions, which are now including green commitments. So these recitals, these preambles are very powerful in interpreting the agreement, because they provide a kind of normative direction as to how the terms in the agreement are being constructed. Declassification events. So green loans and sustainability-linked loans don't include in their list of defaults or default events that you have something that contravenes the green aim or the sustainability aim of the loan. Rather, what they do is they'll just declassify the product. So if you breach the green provisions or you breach the sustainability provisions, you're not going to lose your money. You're not going to, void the loan completely. The bank won't rescind the loan, but they will declassify it. And you will no longer get the advantages of the loan being green or sustainability linked. We're seeing margin adjustments or interest ratchet clauses. And overall, green standards are now being integrated into all aspects of loan form documentation. So we are seeing new things happening for the first time in these ship finance documents. Maersk in particular likes to use sustainability-linked loans. So I know that Maersk has been using that loan documentation. Green chartering. So I think Eric and Hendrik have done a very good job of showing some of the regulatory initiatives that are going to directly impact on the chartering relationship between ship owner and charterer. And as such, chartering has become a hotspot area for the sustainable contract law debate. So there's a wider contract law debate here at play as to whether the English common law, which is really the main jurisdiction or choice of law for many of these agreements, whether it is actually suitable for sustainability purposes. So there's quite a funny quote by an economist called Martin Stockford. He's an old economics professor and professional who has commented a lot on the shipping sector, in particular the chartering relationship. And he calls chartering and shipping contracts a Jurassic Park. He says, where the dinosaurs of classical economics run free, because it is just such an old way of thinking when we look at chartering agreements. And we know that the ship industry has a preference for uniformity and the NYPE forms and these documents that really haven't seen much updating in recent times. We also know that laissez-faire contract law has remained incredibly resilient to any attempt at embedding it in a wider socio-political context. So you've kind of got this paradox here where shipping lawyers are saying, well, this is for the regulator, but traditionally they haven't liked regulation because they adopt this approach of laissez-faire capitalism within their market contracts. So you've got that paradox of how do we incorporate sustainability into our agreements when the common law isn't well adapted for doing so, especially if you're not developing express terms at the rate needed. Does the common law still remain the main regulator of contracts? Are there other things to consider? Should we really continue to adhere to this formalistic viewpoint and allocation of rights and duties within the chartering relationship? Or does it spark a question of the modernization of contract law for sustainability purposes? The private actors are increasingly relying on contract governance approaches and new types of contractual mechanisms that we haven't seen before to implement the sustainability agenda. We know that charter parties are not governed by international conventions, but predominantly by English common law. And we are all familiar with the implied and customary obligations within these agreements, seaworthiness, reasonable dispatch. All of these are going to have to require rethinking. So Eric spoke a lot about the due dispatch, the obligation in voyage charter parties, and how the Rotterdam Rules has considered that maybe we should have some sort of force majeure clause or amend that provision for the protection of the marine environment so that you don't have to proceed with due dispatch if there is a threat to the environment. But everything needs to be reconsidered. Seaworthiness. There's talks about maybe considering a concept of green worthiness. Okay, how does this all interplay with each other? How are these contractual duties that are so commonly and fundamentally understood, how are they either hindering the sustainability agenda or how can they be used to promote it? We also know there's a small pool of charter party standard forms to choose from. The NYP forms remain dominant. And we still see a lot of ship owners relying on the NYP 46, which is a much older version of the form. And we see that the problem of split incentives is embedded in the traditional chartering relationship. We've seen it with the emissions ETS, so the emissions trading scheme. How are you going to negotiate who surrenders allowances? That is very much divided upon charter ship owner lines, bilateral agreements, which are seen as a strong opposition of interests as opposed to a collaboration towards a unified agenda. So all of these things are built into traditional charter parties that we need to think about and we need to reconsider. We are seeing green clauses for charter parties. So there have been developments. You know, BIMCO's done quite a bit of work. The Sea Cargo Charter, which is a voluntary initiative, has also given us a template clause, although its template clause is quite standard. It doesn't impose too many unusual obligations. I wouldn't say the Sea Cargo Charter template clause is particularly innovative. It really just shows a commitment to the Sea Cargo Charter. But then the Chancery Lane project has developed a number of new climate clauses, specifically for shipping contracts. And the BIMCO CII clause, I think, is really marking a new direction in charter parties because of some of the language we are seeing in that clause and some of the more cooperative norms that are new to charter parties. So these are BIMCO's ETS clauses. BIMCO has provided us with 4 clauses for voyage charters as well as 1 for time charters. I think when it comes to these clauses, you've got a choice here as to how you're going to comply. But really, we're seeing the same diversion of responsibility. We're seeing that same opposition of bilateral interests. Whether it's the charter's responsibility or the ship owner's responsibility, there's not much scope here or room here to work together. Whereas we see in the BIMCO CI clause a whole new type of language that is very much aligned with the new age of climate drafting. So in particular, the BIMCO clause says parties shall cooperate and work together in good faith. Now, the sector doesn't like this clause because they don't really know what it means. They think it's vague. But this is where we're going with contractual drafting, because at the end of the day, your GHG reporting, so your emissions reporting, your emission savings, and how you're going to achieve that is a combined and collaborative commitment. It's not something that necessarily should be seen as trying to pass off the responsibility of compliance. It's something that all actors are going to have to work towards and think about, and how they're going to construct contractual clauses to achieve that collaboration. Where traditionally we know that these good faith requirements, collaborative requirements are considered quite wishy-washy. We're going to have to give them teeth going forward within chartering. These are the Chancery Lane project shipping clauses, also very innovative language we have not yet seen in charter parties. They also talk about green norms, commitments to external frameworks, commitments to decarbonisation as a shared commitment, not just the responsibility of either one of the parties involved. So you can go have a look at those and how they are drafted. And finally, moving on to marine insurance. Okay, so this is probably well, I would not know necessarily what underwriters have been doing thus far, but this is the first publicly made available information to start evidencing that marine insurers are starting to think about sustainability and specifically decarbonisation. So we had Poseidon principles for financial institutions. We then had the Sea Cargo Charter come out, which was the subsequent initiative for charterers and ship owners. And the latest development with Poseidon principles has been the principles for marine insurance. They apply a very similar kind of approach to what we see for financial institutions and for chartering, but really it requires assessment and disclosure. So assurers with hull and machinery portfolios who are signatories to the Poseidon Principle for marine insurance will have to report annually on how their hull and machinery portfolios are aligned with the IMO's decarbonisation targets. The Nordic Marine Insurance Plan has also considered a wider range of ESG factors than we have seen before. It allows for the disqualification of shipyards with poor ESG performance. There's also a built-in incentive for the assured to choose a yard with low CO2 emissions, and the assured can then recover the costs of taking such a decision if that yard does not offer the lowest adjusted tender, but has advantageous emission savings. So we're starting to see some of these incentives be embedded into insurance plans and insurance products as well. But then again, this begs the question of contractual integration. So I hope you see that the common thread between all of these new initiatives is they're going to have to require new ways of thinking about contracts and new mechanisms for contractual implementation. So that brings me up to some of my conclusions, that really there is a huge role for contract law to play here, whether it be green finance, whether it be the Fit for 55 legislative package that applies to charterers and ship owners. All of this is going to require a rethinking of contracts and how contracts can either further the spirit and purport of our decarbonisation agenda or can work against that agenda by holding on to outdated clauses or clauses that try to embed some of those laissez-faire capitalistic approaches that we see to traditional charter party agreements or to traditional ship finance forms. We are seeing the emergence of new norms in contracts. Okay, I know many of us might be shuddering at this idea of having norms in contract law, but they are starting to emerge increasingly when you interpret contracts that either have a green preamble or sustainability recital and then have green factors expressly provided for in other areas of the contract. We're going to have to start aligning our interpretation of those contracts with sustainability agendas. So we are seeing new norms, we are seeing new contractual mechanisms emerge, these duties to cooperate, to collaborate, as well as we're seeing in loan documentation, the idea of a sustainability amendment event or declassification events. So things that have not necessarily existed before in loan market documentation. Advance warning is another thing that we're seeing a lot in climate clauses. That if there is any reasonable suspicion of non-compliance advance warning can be demanded from the other party, or there's even a duty to warn the other party in a contract that you might be at risk of non-compliance, so that you can immediately correct the situation and work collaboratively to amend the situation that might lead to a regulatory breach or might lead to a breach of the agreed commitments in terms of decarbonization. An increased commitment to data sharing. Data sharing is really going to inform not only compliance, but how parties meet their contractual obligations. So this poses a high administrative burden, where we need many of the technology platforms to come in and assist in terms of how we're going to manage data, how we're going to have access to data in real time. You're going to have to know about a ship's sustainability performance at any given time to know if that ship is compliant. So there's a high administrative burden, which probably manifests as another cost. You now need to purchase new data platforms and software. We're seeing an aspirational behavior that is norm-driven, stemming from an external source. So contracts are now having to consider the external milieu, which is one of a sustainable development agenda, and even more specifically, a decarbonization mandate. But we're also seeing new risks emerge from this. So we're going to have to think of ways to manage increasing risk. There's regulatory risk, so the risk of non-compliance, greenwashing. So we're seeing this wave of climate litigation try and, I wouldn't say attack, but trying to challenge financial products, to challenge banks, financial stakeholders. And we also know that voluntary schemes also pose a huge greenwashing risk, so they need to be properly audited. So we're going to need certification schemes and auditing schemes to come on board for not only regulatory certification schemes, but also the voluntary certification schemes. So there's a lot of work for private actors to do. So the one message I really want to leave everyone with today is we can't think about this as ship owner and regulator, and the regulator just imposing all of these standards and the ship owner being, poor me, how am I going to do all of this? There are so many actors involved that are going to have to make decarbonization happen. And it affects every aspect of the supply chain. It affects finance, fuel bunkering, shipyards was mentioned. Shipyards are in a very precarious position because they not only have all these design standards to now deal with, but they are also subject to increasing regulatory pressures, such as the CSDDD and other EU initiatives, which are posing extra regulatory compliance burdens on them. So there's a lot of work to be done. My sentiments from what I have gauged from the firm that I'm now based in is that not enough is happening yet. Clients aren't coming forward yet and saying this is something they want to do. They're kind of putting their head in the sand. I think the work will come later when the problems arise, when we have non-compliance, when we have charter party disputes about responsibility for compliance. At the moment, most of the decarb work is kind of advisory, but very much looking to, be mindful of the fact that this regulation is going to apply to you soon. Just be mindful. No action is actually taking place yet. I don't know what the varying experiences are of people in this room as to how private actors are dealing with decarbonization. There are a lot of voluntary initiatives. So there's a lot of offsetting and insetting schemes that are going on at a voluntary level. But many of these offsetting and insetting schemes that are voluntary are quite dubious. I'm not quite sure if they really are all that green and sustainable. They really are just another way to commoditize GHG emissions and make more money out of this decarbonization agenda. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see what solutions emerge. But the idea is that the regulators need to work in collaboration with all of these private actors, because the private actors are the ones that are going to effectively mobilize the action that is necessary. So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview of how extensive decarbonization is in terms of its reach. It's not just about regulation, but it's about a number of private transactions. And that is where I'm going to leave you today. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please let me know.